I'm Jeff Asher, and this is the Jeff-alytics podcast. You can talk about crime in the criminal justice system in charts and trend lines all day, and I certainly do. But for a lot of people, the system isn't an abstract debate. It's a missing parent, it's a childhood shaped by visiting rules, court dates, phone calls, and silence. It's a stigma that follows families into classrooms, workplaces, and relationships. And it's the reality that punishment doesn't stop at the person who gets sentenced. That's why this episode in particular matters. In this conversation, I'm joined by Ifetayo Harvey, who brings both lived experience and policy knowledge to the question of how we talk about drugs, crime, and public safety. Ife shares what it meant to grow up with a father who was incarcerated, and how that experience reshaped the way she understands the war on drugs, the narratives used to justify it, and the real human costs that don't always show up in a news segment. We also dig into how language can either reinforce stigma or restore dignity, what policymakers often miss about what justice-impacted families actually go through, and what the system should be measuring if it's serious about outcomes, not just arrests. This is a conversation about the personal realities behind public policy and what changes when we start telling the story from inside out. Ifetayo, thank you so much for joining the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff. I'm really excited to be here.
Excellent. So let's dive in. First question is, can you take me through, what is your background? How did you get here?
Yes. So how did I get here? Back when I was a student in undergrad, I was offered the opportunity to do an internship with the Drug Policy Alliance. They're a national organization based in New York that does broad drug policy reform, meaning taking our drug laws out of the criminal justice system and making it more of a public health issue. And so I was drawn to the Drug Policy Alliance because they were the first organization that I came across that talked about drug users in a kind, compassionate way. And I started sharing my story of growing up with my father in prison and being deported and how that impacted me as a kid when I started my internship at the Drug Policy Alliance. And so for me, this was really uncovering a lot of things from my childhood that I wanted to bury as opposed to, really understand the impacts. So when I started writing and speaking, I was realizing that my story isn't really that unique after all, given the war on drugs. I learned that 1 in 8 Black children will have a parent in prison. And the statistic for Latino children or white children aren't as stark, but they're still there, right? So it goes to show that we're all impacted by mass incarceration and the war on drugs. And after I graduated in 2014, I went on to work for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They do clinical research on MDMA for people with PTSD. So they do a specific therapy for people with treatment PTSD using MDMA or what is known on the street as Molly or ecstasy. After about 8 months, I left because I wasn't happy. Ultimately, I realized that Black people and people of color were being really underrepresented in the research and in the work in general. And so that's what motivated me to start my organization, the People of Color Psychedelic Collective, and because I wanted to create a platform for people like me to discuss not only the benefits of psychedelics, but also discuss how the war on drugs has impacted our communities.
Can you elaborate a little more and speak a little bit more about your experience being the child of an incarcerated parent and how that sort of influences your approach to all of this?
Yes. So just a little bit about my dad's story. So my dad was an immigrant from Jamaica, and he came here and got involved in the drug game. Unfortunately, he was on the run for about a decade, meaning that he, made bail and just didn't show up for about 10 years. And in that 10 years, I was born. When I was 4, my dad went away. He was sentenced to 15 years for cocaine trafficking. And he was incarcerated in a different state. And so because I was so young when it happened, there was just so much as I got older that I was not 100% clear on. my dad and I, we stayed in touch while he was incarcerated. We communicated through letters. Because he was in another state, I never saw him while he was incarcerated. But being a child of an incarcerated person comes with a specific stigma. Because we stigmatize people who have criminal records, who've been to prison, et cetera, that stigma stays with them for life. And it also stays with their family members, right? So as a kid, I internalized a lot of messages about criminals and prison. And I think part of me thought that my fate would be similar to my father's. And so because of that, I performed goodness. I was always the teacher's pet. I did not want to get in trouble because I know what happens to people who get in trouble. And so there was also a lot of shame attached to that stigma, right? I didn't tell people, like my friends at school, oh, where's your dad? I couldn't just say, oh, he's a deadbeat, because if it was up to my dad, he wouldn't be a deadbeat. I remember one time I did, tell one of my friends at school, oh, my dad's in prison. And they're like, what? Your dad's in prison? So that was probably like third grade, right? So it taught me, okay, I have to make up something else to tell my friends, right? But it also taught me how we see people in prison, how we perceive those people. Oh, they must have done something bad, right? And even as a kid, I didn't understand why. Because the way my mom explained it to me, she's like, oh, your dad went to prison for selling weed. I didn't really know what weed was, but I was like, okay, I knew it was a drug of some sort that adults do. And in my head, thought, well, if they want to do the weed, what's the problem? My dad's just a person selling them what they want. How is that any different from a car salesman? And so now as an adult, I still think that, right? How is that any different than a car salesman or a real estate broker? Most people use drugs of some sort, whether that be caffeine or cocaine or both. And so I still have that attitude when it comes to my work. I don't judge people for using drugs. There's a lot of people in the psychedelic field who believe only psychedelics are good. And if you're doing anything outside of psychedelics, you need help, you need Jesus, you need something. You're not right. What my dad's experience taught me is that we can't dispose of people just because we don't understand or we disagree with what they're doing. Also, I don't judge people who sell drugs. I think that even within the drug policy reform space, right, people will have a lot of empathy for drug users, people who struggle with addiction. But when you talk about people who sell drugs, like my dad, oh, they're the devil. They're the most evil person. They're everything that's wrong with society, right? So we've done a lot of unpacking around the drug user, but we haven't done a lot of unpacking around the drug seller. And people refuse to see how poverty motivates people to get into the drug economy, right? And this is why I say that crime is a social construct, because if we had a sufficient social safety net in this country that eliminated poverty altogether, a lot of the crimes that we consider crimes would not even happen.
And just closing the loop, your dad, after prison, was deported, you said, to...
Yes. So my dad got out of prison. Thankfully, he did not serve all 15 years. He served about 8. And he was deported in 2004 to Jamaica, where he lives today. And thankfully, he's doing well. I want to highlight that deportation is not the end of the issue. My dad was lucky in the sense that nothing happened to him after he was deported. Deportation puts people in a very vulnerable position because, especially if you're from a smaller country, oh, word gets around, there's some guy who just returned from foreign. That's what we say in Jamaica. You just came from foreign. That means you came from the US, you came from Canada, you came from the UK, meaning you probably got more money than us. So it puts you in a vulnerable position to be robbed, to be killed, to be targeted in some way. And a lot of people don't talk about that, right? But thankfully, my dad has been able to make a way for himself in Jamaica. But even then, the emotional toll of incarceration doesn't end when he was released. It's still something that we have to work through.
I appreciate that, and especially appreciate the point about deportation. I hadn't considered that, so I very much appreciate hearing that. What is it that you guys are doing with the collective?
Our primary focus is education and community building. So we do online events, in-person events. A lot of them are education focused. So educating people on the basic 101 of psychedelics, educating people on harm reduction. So how do we reduce the risk associated with using drugs? How do we keep ourselves safe? How do we keep ourselves alive? How do we, also do the same for our family and our friends and our community? What are the cultural issues surrounding psychedelics? Things like indigenous sovereignty and land rights. So we do, we try to talk about anything and everything related to psychedelics, not just the benefits, not just the fun stuff, but also the social and cultural issues connected to psychedelics. So we're really about teaching people this is how our society has been harmed and this is how our society is messed up. And these are some of the tools in the toolbox that you can use to heal yourself, heal your community, etc.
Do you advocate a lot with policymakers, with legislators, and people trying to very big picture change the story?
So that's a great question. I've done some things in the background. So, I've been a part of policy working groups, but in terms of the front facing, advocating for specific policy change, no. I think part of the reason why I kind of stay out of a lot of the policy around psychedelics is because for me, my personal stance is that we should decriminalize drug use and possession, period, across the board. It's the whole rigmarole, and it's also just not enough for the moment that we're in. We cannot rely on this kind of fragmented policy to move us forward. The moment that we're in calls for something much bigger.
Can you walk me through kind of the landscape of the policy reform, drug reform efforts being made right now?
Yes. Well,
I know that's an enormous question, but
it is.
Give the abridged version.
Yes. So I'll start with some of the policy efforts happening in the psychedelic world, and then I'll try to branch out beyond that. So there was just a new law passed in New Mexico to create a psilocybin program. It's still being worked out. They're in the very beginning stages of implementing things, but there are some differences with this policy in terms of the intention put in. I know that New Mexico has a pretty large indigenous population. And so some considerations around indigenous people's rights have been written into the policy, but there are also groups who are organizing and advocating in New York for psilocybin as well.
And can you speak to some of the perceptions? This is the idea of the pod is talking about the perceptions about crime and why people tend not to believe just the raw data when we look at whether crime is going up or down. Can you speak to some of the perceptions, rightly or wrongly, surrounding drug use and crime, and especially narcotics trade in crime?
I think that lately in media news, we've been seeing this attempt to tie drug users and homelessness with crime. It's being done intentionally, and this is an old method in the playbook that goes back to the Nixon era, right? Crime is a social construct because the government can decide tomorrow that walking down the street with a red shirt on is illegal, just like they did with drugs, even though humans have been engaging in this behavior for centuries. Nixon particularly decided that, hey, we need to criminalize drug use. So the onset of the war on drugs was based on a false premise, and they played on people's perceptions of drugs and crime. If you look at the statistics from the Nixon era around drug use was actually down. But what Nixon and his cabinet did, they used fear-mongering techniques to say oh, drug use is increasing in our cities. And you know what that means? That means XYZ.
So I wanted to ask somewhat similarly, when we look at crime, the perception, and I've talked about this on the pod several times, but YouGov had a poll recently about asking if murder was higher now than it was in 2020 and in 1990. And across every age group, across every gender, across every race, every income, every political group, everyone said it was higher now than it was 5 years ago and 35 years ago, and demonstrable fact that it's lower now than it was then. I imagine you run into similar issues in your work. Why do you think this perception gap persists?
Well, I think it's because we're visual creatures, especially nowadays. We're inundated with images on social media, on the news, TV. So we're seeing these images, and that's changing what we perceive our reality to be. We're not actually looking at the statistics of comparing, okay, what are the murder rates from 2020 versus now versus 1990? We're not actually looking at the numbers. And it's unfortunate that a lot of our news is not presenting these numbers within context. So it becomes this kind of perception war in terms of who can create the narrative that most people are going to believe.
And so what are some of the unique challenges when you're trying to communicate these issues? What do you have to deal with and overcome?
So a lot of it is me already knowing the drug war talking points. A lot of times when I tell people, like I said earlier, all drug use and possession should be decriminalized, I already know what people are going to say to me in response to that. So I already have a rebuttal ready. And so what it is having to shift and reframe people's perceptions of drugs. It's really about kind of repeating back to people what they're saying and helping them understand that you actually don't have any evidence to prove that this would happen. This is just a guess.
So when you're communicating, you're out there, you're pseudo advocating, how do you measure success in terms of the short term, the medium term, the long term?
In the short term or the medium term, sometimes it's, having a conversation, maybe ending that conversation with both of us having new things to think about. So if, say, for example, if you're a person at my event and you're like, I don't know about all this drug stuff, this seems kind of wacky. Maybe we sit down and have a conversation, and maybe I change your mind a little bit, or maybe I help you reconsider some of the things that you previously thought. And maybe you give me some things to think about in terms of how I present my information. So that's kind of a shorter term thing, right? I think in terms of longer term and medium term, I think it's about, are we able to sustain ourselves as an organization? Do we still have community with other organizations doing the same thing? Do we have partnerships? Do we also have support from the communities that we're claiming to serve? I think that our relationships that we build and that we sustain over time are like the ultimate testament to success. When we put a title on ourselves before we even have the evidence to really show for it, I think we kind of put the cart before the horse. And so for me, it's really important that we build relationships that are praxis aligned, that are value aligned, and that we're able to sustain and build something even better in the future.
What have you found is the most effective means of communicating a complex story like this, and everything you're bringing to the table in terms of what you're hoping to accomplish?
The most effective means is sharing my story. I think that when you put a human face to it, people understand it differently than statistics and research and reports. When I tell people about my story, a lot of folks are surprised. A lot of people relate. I think that's something I underestimated. There's so many people out there with stories like mine. Maybe their dad didn't go away for 8 years. Maybe he wasn't deported. Maybe he was just in and out of jail, right? Or maybe he just went to jail once. But I found that when we create a story out of our life, people can kind of relate to it or just make more sense of it.
sort of putting on the imaginary hat, if there was one piece of data, or not, don't hold yourself to just one. If there are pieces of information that you think that we sort of need to collect that we don't, yeah, I'd just be curious what would that information be, and sort of how would that impact the criminal justice system?
I think one that I'm really interested in is the health outcomes of incarcerated people, justice impacted people, and their families. I think there's discussion around the health outcomes of incarcerated people, but I think it would be really impactful to look at their health and financial outcomes long term and their families, like their spouses or children, immediate family. I think it's important to look at that to see, to really understand the impacts of incarceration.
I'm gonna jump in and give a plug to Mike Mueller-Smith. Has, I don't know if you've heard of this, the Justice Outcome Explorer, which seeks to do exactly that. And it doesn't get quite to that level in terms of the families, but they use all sorts of relationships to link outcomes of like what happens when people are incarcerated and then what happens after that. And I know that it's incredibly difficult for them. I'll give a plug, joe.cjars.org, which is a terrific, interesting website if you've used it. If you could force policymakers to sort of sit through one day in the life of a justice impacted family, what would that be like? What are the most important things that you would want to see happen?
This is a fun question because I honestly think we should make this a reality TV show in the US. I think people would love to watch this. It kind of reminds me of Wife Swap, and instead it's class swap. Swap your class for a different class. So for me, it would be really important if a policymaker were to sit through the day in the life of a justice impacted family or person. For that simulation, the policymaker would need to be cut off from all of their resources, all of their money, their networks, all that stuff, right? For that day, they should not have access to it. And then they would need to be a part of the family and contribute to the family, figure out a way to contribute to the family. And if by the end of the day they don't, then they fail. So I think part of that challenge would be, okay, you need to look for employment. And because they're with a justice impacted family, they also need to assume all of the record that the justice impacted family has. So if, say, the father or the mother has a criminal record, then that policymaker should assume that for the day and try to look for a job as a person with a criminal record, just to see how hard it is and how many barriers that people who are just impacted go through when looking for a job, when trying to better themselves or to improve their situation. And I think at the end they should be judged on whether they did well or not.
So how are we going to make this reality show a reality? I don't know anybody at Bajo. Do you?
Oh man, I think I have a few connections. I can make a couple calls after this, and I
Yeah.
think we can really pitch them.
I'll executive produce. I like it.
I love it.
So getting back to the seriousness of the issue, when we talk about drug use, and I'm sure this is a trap that I fall into, what is the best way to talk about it without reinforcing stigma? And I know that this is a big part of what you do is communicating these issues. How do you do that without making the situation worse, especially for users and people that are using it for, the reasons that you advocate?
Yes, that's a great question. I think a lot of times people get a little intimidated or they don't want to step on toes when it comes to talking about drug use or drug users. But I think the most important thing to remember is to not define people by their dysfunction or what society deems as their dysfunction, right? So for a lot of people, they refer to drug users as addicts, junkies, all this stigmatizing language. And we have to remember that at the end of the day, they are people first. And so there's been a push in the drug reform movement, but also other movements to use what we call person first language to center people's personhood and their humanity because the language we use also has an impact, right? And so we want people to feel like they are valued and that they are human. There's also a lot of organizations like the National Harm Reduction Coalition, Drug Policy Alliance, a bunch of organizations who have created glossaries or dictionaries for journalists with suggestions on what language to use. So instead of using addict, you could say person who struggles with drug use, or a person who has substance use disorder. Or instead of assuming that everyone who uses drugs is an addict, say drug user. So there's a lot of resources out there for journalists who are looking for like glossaries, dictionaries, best practices, that kind of thing, that describe or go in more detail about what specific language to use.
That's great. So very important. I understand you took the LSATs recently. How did it go?
Oh, man. Yes. Oh, I took the LSAT. I finally got it over with. It went well. I feel good about the tests. It took about 4 hours, but I'm so glad to be done with it. It's just like a weight of relief off my shoulders now.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
This is fantastic. I really appreciate hearing your perspective. I think it's very important and, absolutely speaks to the heart of the podcast, which is all about the perceptions around crime, the perceptions around what is happening. And sometimes we see increases in crime, but almost always people think it's going up regardless of what's happening. So I think that this is an extremely important perspective to be able to add to it. What's next for you? Where can people follow you if they want to?
Yes, you can follow us at www.pocpc.org, sign up for our email list, and stay in touch for some of our upcoming events.
Great. Ifetayo, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to the Jeff-alytics podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and to learn more, head on over to ahdatalytics.com for more information and previous episodes. If you like what you heard, please leave a glowing review, which will help others to discover the show. Until next time, I'm Jeff Asher.